Our review application workflow is working great, but it could be more reliable. Let's fix that in this video. As we roll along in this series on using Kamal to spin up review applications when opening new pull requests, things are shaping up nicely. We have a GitHub Actions workflow creating new servers on the cloud, set up a destination for these review apps, and automated the deploy process to get a new instance of a web application up and running on a unique domain name. This entire sequence already works great to let teams begin testing pull requests when using Kamal for deployments, but we still have some lingering issues to address. In part 3 of this series, we set up our continuous integration environment, GitHub Actions, to have Kamal set up and deploy the application to the new server we spin up when opening a pull request. To handle this, I set up the workflow to check the event type to determine which step to take. If we trigger the workflow from opening a pull request, we'll run Kamal setup. If the workflow event is from an update to the topic branch for the PR, we'll run Kamal deploy instead. The reason for splitting up these steps is because Kamal needs to perform the initial setup and subsequent deployments separately. The Kamal setup command installs Docker on the host servers if it's not present, boots up all defined accessories in the configuration, then performs the initial deployment. The Kamal deploy command bypasses the Docker check and booting of accessories, only doing the deployment step. The problem that we face with these commands is that they're dependent on one another. If we run Kamal setup on a server that already had the command complete successfully, Kamal will attempt to boot the accessories again and fail because they're already available on the remote servers. Similarly, if we run Kamal deploy on a server that has never completed the setup step, Kamal will also fail since the server won't have some of the components it needs. Because there are two separate commands that we need to run with Kamal, it requires us to conditionally check when we should run either command from an automated process like we're doing in our workflow. If we're opening or reopening a pull request, we'll run the setup command since part of the workflow spins up a fresh new server on the cloud. But if we're updating the branch for a pull request, we're assuming Kamal is already set up on the server from the initial setup and we'll run the deploy command instead. This process is fine if everything works as expected, but you can't trust that the setup step will always complete successfully. There's always the possibility of something not working, and the only way to resolve issues around the setup and deploy steps with our current workflow is to delete the pull request to tear down the server and open a new pull request to start the process from scratch. This is far from ideal, so we want to fix this so that GitHub Actions doesn't rely on the type of event triggering the workflow. Unfortunately, Kamal doesn't have a command or other straightforward way to determine whether an application is fully deployed on a server. Kamal has commands like Kamal accessory details all to check the accessories currently running on a server. We could potentially use this and similar commands to parse any details we need, like checking the availability of an accessory to determine that we've completed the setup step previously. However, these commands carry their own sets of risks. For instance, if we write a script that uses Kamal accessories details all to find the list of known accessories that our application needs, it can work for the existing state of the application. But in the future, we might modify the accessories to add a new one or remove an existing one we no longer need, meaning that we'll need to remember to update our scripts to account for the change. It's really easy to forget this and makes the review application process brittle, so I wouldn't recommend this process. Instead, an easier and more stable solution to verifying whether a Kamal managed application has been set up on a remote server is to take advantage of Kamal hooks. Kamal hooks are a way to allow us to execute custom commands and scripts at different points of the Kamal lifecycle. When initializing Kamal in a project, it creates a directory under .kamal/hooks in the project repository containing various sample scripts for each kind of hook that Kamal can fire from your system. These hooks can help us further automate certain actions that need to happen when running a Kamal command. Some helpful uses of Kamal hooks are updating Docker's configuration after Kamal installs it on your remote server, performing continuous integration checks before Kamal begins the deployment process, or sending notifications after Kamal successfully deploys an application. Kamal has different hooks that can fire off before building the Docker image for your application, before and after it deploys, and many more. Sadly, Kamal does not have a post setup hook that would have been perfect for our use case. Out of the existing hooks included with Kamal, the pre-deploy hook is the closest one that runs after the initial setup happens. As the name suggests, the hook runs just before the deployment step kicks off, making it a good spot to indicate that the setup process completed successfully on the server previously. Now, what indicator can we use to mark a server as having its Kamal setup done? The simplest way I found is to create an artifact on the remote server that we can use on the GitHub Actions workflow to check just before deciding whether to run the setup or deploy command. If the artifact, in our case a file, doesn't exist on the server, we'll assume the setup step hasn't happened yet. Otherwise, we can assume that the presence of the file on the server means that everything is in place for deployments. Granted, this still isn't a 100% bulletproof solution, since the pre-deploy hook still runs just before accessories are booted for the first time during the setup process, and there's a very slight possibility of the hook firing off the script before that happens. However, I've been using Kamal for quite a while and this has never happened to me, so I think it's a rare occurrence and it's an acceptable trade-off for what we want to accomplish with our review app workflow. The files inside the .kamal hooks directory are scripts interpreted by the system running the Kamal commands. The samples generated by the Kamal init command when setting up the project initially shows various ways to use hooks, from basic shell scripts to fully-fledged Ruby scripts. The only things we need to do to fire off these hooks properly is to ensure that the file name doesn't have any extension attached to it and that the script returns a zero exit code. Any non-zero exit codes in a hook will abort the Kamal command. So let's begin setting up the pre-deploy script by using the sample that exists on the repository. So let's open this to just see what it is. And this file has a Ruby script as an example to demonstrate how we can use this kind of hook. So before I do anything here, I'll remove this sample extension here and just call the file pre-deploy because that's what Kamal expects. So now that we have that here in the script, I'll clear everything that's already here and create a very simple shell script starting with the bin sh shebang at the beginning of the file. I'll then open an if statement to check the value of the Kamal destination environment variable and make sure that it equals review. So we can only run this pre-deploy script when we're deploying using the review destination set up in part 2 of this video series. The Kamal destination environment variable comes from Kamal, which sets a few predefined environment variables like this one to use for our hooks. The documentation has more details about what environment variables are available to use in hooks, so check that out if you want to learn more. I'll continue the if statement by setting then and fi at the end of it. And then in our conditional statement, I want to connect to the remote server via SSH using the root user, which is the default user for the Kamal deployments. And the intent is to run the script on the GitHub Actions workflow that we set up previously. So we'll have access to the review app IP environment variable that's set up on the runner, which points to our new server for deployments. When connected to the server, I want to run a command to create a new file in the root user's home directory. So I'll open double quotes here. And to create a new file, I'll use the echo command. And for the string that I want to echo, so I can use as the contents of the file to create on the server, I'll use another of Kamal's environment variables called Kamal version, enclosing it in quotes to ensure that it's set correctly. This environment variable contains the commit shell currently being deployed. I'll redirect this content using the greater than symbol to a new file in the current user's home directory called Kamal version, which will serve as our signal that the Kamal setup command already happened on this server. One thing to note here is that while I'm using the Kamal version environment variable as the contents of the file that I'll create on the remote server, I'll only check that this file exists and has something written to it to indicate that the pre-deploy hook happened. So you don't need to use this environment variable. You can use any text for this purpose as long as you set something inside of the file just to indicate that something happened. This wraps up the pre-deploy hook. So now we'll need to update our continuous integration workflow to check the existence of this file and determine which command to run. I'll open up the .github/workflows/review app deploy.yaml file that we set up before in this video series to modify the existing workflow that provisions the server on Hetzner Cloud and conditionally runs the Kamal setup or Kamal deploy command. The first thing I'll do is to remove these two conditional steps that I set previously in the deploy job that checks for the event type, so we won't need these anymore. After removing those two steps, I'll replace them with two new steps. I'll name the first new step as add host key to known hosts. And this step will run a multi-line shell script. So I'll add run here and use the pipe to indicate that it's a multi-line script. And the first command that I want to run here is the make directory command to create a new directory called /home/runner.ssh. I'll also include the p flag here to create any necessary parent directories and the m flag to set the mode to 700, giving it full access to the current user. The next command after creating this directory is the ssh keyscan command, which grabs the public key fingerprints from a remote server, which we'll need to bypass the verification prompt when we attempt to connect to a new server via SSH. I plan to use SSH in the next step in this workflow, and in GitHub Actions, we don't have the opportunity to respond to this prompt, so this command sets up the necessary file and contents to allow us to make SSH connections later without needing to accept any verification prompts. I'll connect to the review app server through its IP address, which is already defined in this job in the review app IP environment variable, and I'll append it to the /home/runner/.ssh/known host file. This file is where Linux looks for the public keys by default, which is why I needed to create the directory in the previous command. The known host file also must have read and write access only for the current user. So I'll add one more command here to set this up with the chmod command using 600 for read and write permissions and set it on the file, which is the same one as we used earlier, which is known hosts. And that'll be it for this first step. The second step I'll create here will be called set up or deploy with Kamal. And it'll also run a multi-line shell script. And this step will do a few things. First, we'll connect to the server via SSH to check if the Kamal version file exists in the root user's home directory and that it has contents, and we'll store that result in a variable. So I'll start by creating a variable here called Kamal version exists, and I want to set the value as a result of a command that I'll run on the server. So I'll place my command inside the $ and parentheses. And then the command that I want to execute here is a single SSH command that performs a conditional check in the remote server and prints out a value to indicate whether the Kamal version file exists and that it isn't empty. So I'll start with the SSH connection and connect as the root user, connecting to the remote server, which again we'll have access to under review app IP. And just like the pre-deploy script, I'll execute a command on the server. So I'll open the double quotes here to execute the conditional check on the remote server. I'll write a single line conditional check starting with the if statement, and then checking for the existence of the file and that it has contents, which can be done using the S flag here, and the file that we want to check, which is Kamal version in the current user's home directory. The S flag here checks that Kamal version exists as a regular file on the server and that its file size is greater than 0, meaning that it has some content inside of it. I'll end the conditional check with a semicolon, and then if the condition passes, I'll echo a value of 1. Otherwise, I'll echo a value of 0, and we'll finish this with the FI at the end. So to summarize, this command inside of the $ in parentheses will connect to the remote server as a root user, and check if the Kamal version file inside of that current user's home directory exists and that it has content. It'll then print 1 or 0 and assign that value to the Kamal version exists variable that I set in the beginning of this command. The shell on the runner, which is bash, doesn't have a dedicated Boolean data type, so using 1s and 0s like this kind of served that purpose. After running SSH and checking for our artifact on the remote server, we'll then use this information to determine whether to run Kamal setup or Kamal deploy. So after setting the variable, I'll create another conditional check here using if, and then check the value of the Kamal version exists variable, and checking that it equals 1 using the EQ flag and the value, which is 1. If it is, that means our pre-deploy hook already ran previously, and we can assume the Kamal setup step already happened, meaning that we can simply deploy. So I'll start this condition with a then and close it with a fi at the end. And then I'll just echo a message here indicating that we're running the Kamal deploy command, and then actually execute that command with bundle exec Kamal deploy, setting the destination using the D flag and the name of the destination, which is review. However, if the value of the Kamal version exists variable doesn't equal 1, then we can assume the Kamal setup command either hasn't been performed before or it didn't complete successfully, so we can run the setup step here in this condition. So I'll do the same here, echoing a message to say that we're running Kamal setup, and I'll execute the Kamal setup command using the review destination as before. Now we have a single step that'll handle either scenario depending on the server's state. With these changes, I can commit them to a branch in the application's repository and open a new pull request. And we can see the message indicating that the initial Kamal setup command is running. We can see from the GitHub Actions logs that the updated steps in the deploy workflow ran successfully, and we can see the message indicating that the initial Kamal setup command ran. If I add a new commit to the pull requests branch and push it to the repository, GitHub Actions will fire off again once more, but this time the logs will show that a normal Kamal deployment happened this time, which is the expected action since the server has a valid Kamal version file inside of the server that we're checking here in this step. We now made our review app workflow a bit more reliable in case of failure when setting up the new server using Kamal. Our review app workflow now has a single step that lets us execute the correct command instead of being tied by the triggering event, knowing when the Kamal setup has completed previously on the review application server. We can now rest easy knowing that if some failure occurred before the initial setup completed, we can fix it in the same pull request instead of tearing everything down to recreate it. This process isn't a perfect solution though, as there are still potential edge cases where the setup step doesn't complete successfully, and attempting to run the Kamal setup step again won't work as expected. However, I've been using Kamal for over a year and I haven't had this issue yet, but keep in mind that something can still go wrong with these updates. Something else to keep in mind is that this process works great in our example scenario because we're using a single Hetzner Cloud server to deploy the review app. If we need to spin up more than one server as part of our review app infrastructure, this process will get more complex as we need to verify the state of each server before deciding which Kamal command to run. If you have suggestions on how to improve this workflow, reach out to me and share your tips. I'd love to improve what I have here. But at this point, we can consider our workflow complete and fairly reliable. I would recommend this process for teams looking to implement review application functionality outside of platforms like Heroku. In my final video covering this topic, I'll add a few extras to this workflow to make things faster and more convenient for anyone needing to build and access these review apps. So keep an eye out for that one by subscribing to this channel and to watch more videos that help teams ship their code confidently, from development to testing to deployment. You can also check my website for a written version of this video, along with more in-depth articles covering Rails, testing, DevOps, and other software engineering topics. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.